Welcome to Bible for Overcomers. So, Christians and civil authority, Romans 13. This set of passages, I feel like, has been misinterpreted by many Christian leaders. And I'm just going to give you my take on this. I'm looking at Romans 13, and I see where we are to obey rulers. Keeping in mind that Peter said we ought to obey God rather than man back in about Acts chapter 5, chapter 6. So keep that in mind as we read this. Romans chapter 13, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. Remember that word powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth God, the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou not be afraid then of the power? Do that which is good, and you shall have praise of the same. For he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if you do that which is evil, be afraid, for he bears not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that does evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. So, pay your tribute, render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Okay, so when I read this, if the way I've heard this interpreted by various teachers and expositors is that, Joseph Stalin, who conducted the Red Terror after Lenin died, following the Bolshevik Revolution, that would mean that Joseph Stalin was ordained by God to run the show and to shoot thousands of people deep down in the forest, send millions and millions to their death on trains going to the gulags. No, I don't believe that for a second. So when I read this right here, when I read higher powers, the powers that be, in the United States, that would be the U.S. Constitution, period. If you're in the UK, that would be the Constitution of English civil law. If you were in France, that would be the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. Not every, but most every nation has a founding body of laws. Now maybe it's changed since that time, but there's a founding body of laws, and when rulers act like despots and they act contrary to God, remember what was happening there in Acts chapter 5. Peter says we should obey God rather than men. Was he just objecting to the Jews and their religious law? No, because the Romans were allowing the Jews to run the religious and the civil functions within that province. They just wanted the tax money, and they didn't want people to get too far out of line. But basically, that's what Peter was doing, was he was disobeying the rulers of his time, because those rulers were going against God's law, just like when rulers go against your constitution or go against what has always been traditional civil law in your country, then you've really, as a Christian, got to look at these verses and think about that. So when I read this, and I read higher powers, I read power, I read whosoever resisteth the power, ordinance, I'm putting into that the Constitution of my country. I would think that that's the only way that you could read this would be real. And let's say there was no Constitution in your country. Let's take this time. Now we know that the Roman emperors were pretty wicked and brutal. But Paul is saying here in these different provinces, no matter where you are, whether you're here in Rome or wherever you are, we are to obey to the best of our ability, as long as it is not going absolutely contrary to us serving God. Now, if you have a disagreement about a tax code, or you have a disagreement about this, you are to work within the law, within the channels. You are not to disobey. You are to work within the channels to get another ruling, to get a clarification on that, to change the law perhaps. But these are not matters that run contrary to our faith. So let's be careful how we read this. So while I don't believe that it tells us to obey totally despotic leaders, and I know somebody's going to say, well, the Roman emperors were despotic. Yes, but you have to understand the Roman Empire was a huge affair by this time. And in these provinces, there was all kinds of layers of civil authority. The Romans didn't just rule, like the Third Reich or something. They didn't just rule as Stalin ruled in the Soviet Union. They gave a lot of authority over to the civil leaders. They didn't want to rock the structure too much. They just wanted everybody to basically be under the Roman rule, but not to every letter in the alphabet. So it was a lot of leeway. So I think that's how I read this. If the rulers are not going against God's law, against you being able to serve God, then we are, to the best of our ability, to obey. Now, we can complain about taxes and big government and how government grows upon itself, and now we have a multiplicity of bureaucracies, yes, but we have to work through the law one way or the other to change that. And I know that's frustrating for some, but this is not a message of revolt, but neither, as some preachers have preached, is it a message here of absolute subservience, of laying down and sacrificing all of your freedoms to serve God and well-being. I just don't believe that. And also, remember Daniel in the Babylonian captivity. The edict came out that there was to be no prayer, and yet Daniel went and prayed, and he found himself in the lion's den for that. So there's a time to disobey, but we need to be careful that it is about God's service, God's business, our relationship with God. But I hate it when I hear Romans 13 quoted as if we should just obey and fervently, enthusiastically throw our support into everything that comes down the pike. I do not believe that either. I believe there's a balance, and I think that the Scripture says that if you look at comparing Scripture with Scripture. That's all I got. Be blessed. Think on these things.